Hello, and welcome to the first of our two military lectures for this week. Today we're going to start with what life was like in the Roman military and how it has changed over time. First, we'll just start with some general information about the Roman military. The Roman army was not just an instrument of combat. It was an essential component of society, economy, and politics. Its prime purpose was, of course, to defeat enemies, and its success depended on weapons, equipment, training, discipline, and the experience of soldiers, all which came from economy, society, and politics. Therefore, the changes in society that we talked about in our history lecture significantly affected the Roman army. But also, the army was an agent of change. It could determine developments in politics, government, economy, and society. War was, of course, the largest task undertaken by the state, and the army, because of this, was the largest institution that the state created. It was also the most expensive. In the empire, 3/4 of the imperial budget was devoted to military exploits. Now let's look how the military happened in the Republic. Modern scholars say that the Roman Republic was militaristic, and the first outsider to write about Rome, the Greek historian Polybius, says basically the same thing. Polybius, in his history, wanted to explain Rome's incredible military success. In the end, he said it was because of the stability of their constitution, the manpower they were able to gather, and their military ethos. He says that in the eve of the Second Punic War, Rome was able to mobilize 700,000 men in the infantry and 70,000 horsemen. This is not a standing army, but the allies and people in Rome. Almost all soldiers were male, able-bodied citizens of Rome and her allies, and they were all expected to serve in the army at one point or another. This was the main duty of a Roman citizen besides voting: serve in the army. Therefore, this meant that military experience was widespread. This was very different from the civilizations that Rome defeated, who relied on mercenaries. This, however, was a large militia force, not military force. This meant that soldiers were recruited on an as-needed basis from the citizen body instead of a standing army. Citizens would be called to fight, go off, fight, and then return home to their fields. While non-citizens could fight, the backbone was a heavy infantry of citizen soldiers. However, Rome's willingness to co-opt conquered peoples into their citizenry gave them an abundant source of manpower. So when we consider this people's almost obsessive concern with military rewards and punishments and the immense importance which they attach to both, it is not surprising that they emerge with brilliant success from every war in which they engage, Polybius says about the Romans. And the Romans did really celebrate military successes. Citizens and allies were awarded in front of the entire army for their bravery, and decorations from these awards were worn on public occasions during the rest of the soldiers' lives. In fact, trophies, which were set up monuments of armament, hung in the most conspicuous places in most everyone's homes. So first, let's look at Harvey number 247, in which Polybius describes Roman battle lines. Romans fought primarily hand-to-hand, so this meant they relied on cohesive lines to provide stability and confidence to the soldiers in the line. The lines were very wide to prevent the enemy army from getting around their sides, and very deep, so men behind the front line could support and replace the soldiers in the thick of the fray. There were 4 different rows in these battle lines. The first were the velites, which were the youngest and the poorest men. They were lightly armed, and they skirmished on the front line or on the flanks. The second row were the hostati, which were also young. And hosta in Latin means spear, so they carried spears. The principes were the third line, and they were the men in the prime of their life, and the triarii were the oldest, most experienced men. So you can see that this system is set up to favor the more experienced men and leave them towards the end of the battle instead of the beginning. Harvey number 248 describes how a legionarius, or legionary basic soldier, would have been equipped. This was a heavy infantryman. Each legionarius carried some very heavy iron armor. It required a lot of strength and endurance due to the weight. There were two main weapons of a Roman soldier. The first was the javelin, or pilum, which is not pictured on our Lego guy here. It was 6 feet long. It had an iron shank attached to a wooden shaft. It was very light, and it was designed to be thrown rather than thrust. Usually a soldier would carry two into battle. They would throw these javelins at the enemy as they approached in an attempt to disrupt the opponent's formation. The second element of the weaponry was the sword, or gladius. It was the main hand-to-hand weapon, so after throwing the javelins, they would then pull out their sword. It had two edges with a sharpened point. It was used for stabbing mostly, but slashing was also possible. This means that instead of swinging and slashing to protect themselves from enemy blows, a Roman soldier usually used their shield for cover and then made quick stabs at the enemy's stomach from behind it with the gladius. Each Roman armyman also had to wear a breastplate, or lorica. This was multiple bands of metal connected with leather straps that ran between the bands on the inside of the breastplate. This had a great advantage. Rather than having a single piece of metal that would not bend or flex, the lorica segmentata, or the segmented breastplate, allowed a soldier to move his arms quite effectively. This means he could throw the pilum with his arm up and stab and thrust with the gladius towards the middle with no resistance. A soldier also wore a helmet, galea, with a crest, crista, a shield, the scutum, which was designed to protect the soldier carrying the shield. And if you're familiar with Greek military tactics, this is very different, in which the Greek shield was wide to cover not only the soldier, but the one next to him. Finally, greaves and boots. Harvey, number 249, tells us about how legions were divided. Legions were divided into 10 cohorts, and within those cohorts, there were 6 centuries. There was also a very strict leadership structure. At the highest level, the Roman military was commanded by senatorial commanders and tribunes of the soldiers. These men got their positions from their political connections rather than their leadership abilities or military experience. But the day-to-day operations were led and decided by the centurions. These were officers in charge of individual centuries in the legion. These were experienced soldiers who rose through the ranks and had a proven military record. Polybius tells us that soldiers in each class elect 10 officers according to ability. They then elect a second group of 10 officers in each class. This sentence tells us how experience was valued by Romans in the military. Polybius also tells us that it is only natural that the Romans preferred to appoint 2 centurions to each maniple rather than 1. This is important not only for sharing power, in that even in the government structure, we see that the consuls, there's always 2 to make sure no one man is in charge, but at the same time, it's also important to never be without an officer. So if one falls or gets scared and runs away, you still have another one. Finally, Polybius told us that the Romans want their centurions to be not so much brave and fearless as good leaders with stable and relaxed natures. A centurion who is willing to lead the charge and start a battle is less qualified in the eyes of the Roman than the one who can hold the ground and be ready to die when he is faced with a superior force or is being hit hard by an enemy. Therefore, the best centurion was not a mindless killing machine, but a logical man who was ready to face and fight the enemy when attacked. The Romans also had a cavalry, which Harvey tells us in selection 251. These were lightly armed men on horses. They protect the flanks of the battle lines and skirmish with the other cavalry in hopes of gaining an advantage and perhaps providing an opportunity for infantry to outflank the army. After a victory, the cavalry would also pursue fleeing enemy infantry and kill as many as they could catch. As Polybius tells us in this selection, the Romans are, indeed, very good about adapting new practices and imitate what others do better than they do, even if those others are foreigners. This shows how adaptable the Roman army was, and this aspect made it very successful. Now let's move on to the military of the empire. Augustus is famously quoted as saying, "I and the army are well." This is because Augustus professionalized the army. Due to the fact that the dominance of the army in the hands of ruthless generals had been a major reason for the political instability of the 1st century BCE and had led to the collapse of the Republic. This sentence also emphasizes who ruled and who backed them. This shows that there was a close connection between the emperor and the armies that displayed an important message, not only to the senators and the people throughout the empire, but to the armies as well. Basically, I'm in charge. The changes Augustus institutionalized into the army are as follows. He set the period of service at 25 years and set the pay of soldiers at 10 coins a day. He also standardized the armor and gear and made permanent garrisons of legions and non-citizen auxiliary forces on the frontiers. He also institutionalized a discharge bonus of 3,000 coins as well as a grant of land somewhere in the Roman Empire. However, despite these changes, it is hard to characterize Roman society in the empire as militaristic to the same degree as in the Republic. More and more recruits from the provinces came to the army, while people in Rome did not serve in the armies anymore. Military service became a lifetime profession for a minority of the empire's inhabitants. They signed up to serve for 25 years, but sometimes lasted even more. Men would die in service, but usually of natural causes, not action. Because of this, a very small percentage of the population served. And of these soldiers, large sections of the empire rarely saw armies, and many soldiers never saw any combat. However, despite this, veterans became an important part of society. If you were a veteran from a legion, you became a prominent member of the local society wherever your land was granted, and if you were from the auxiliary forces, who were usually allies, you earned Roman citizenship when you were discharged. There was also a special guard set up called the Praetorian Guard, who was the emperor's personal protective force, and sometimes they even had a hand in picking the emperor. They played an important role in the accession to the throne of Claudius, in that after killing his predecessor, they chose Claudius to be emperor. In addition, in the year of the 4 empires, the armies of the Rhine, Danube, and East decided who would be put on the throne. This means that emperors could not function without maintaining close relations with the troops. So the most important development in the position of the empire, the most important development in the position of the emperor in the centuries of empire is the changing relationship between the army and emperor. As this declined, troops developed regional ties that proved stronger in times of crisis than the times with Rome or the emperor. This is because Rome and Italy lost centrality, and internal threats played as much of a role in the development of the army as did external wars. Harvey number 253 is written by I guess you would call him a historian named Josephus, who was from conquered Judea, and he has the same goal as Polybius. He tries to tell the readers why the Romans were so good at winning military battles. He says, the Romans, as if they were born with their weapons as part of their bodies, never take a break from training and do not wait for there to be a need to begin their military exercises. In fact, their training is just as vigorous as war itself. Professional armies, like the one instituted by Augustus, needed training to be prepared. Therefore, training was a daily exercise. It's also important to keep them busy while serving garrison duty. Lazy and bored soldiers lead to problems in the local cities. Josephus also says that confusion does not cause the battle line to lose cohesion. The soldiers do not freeze with fear. They do not weary easily from their labors. Because their opponents cannot match their abilities, victory is a guaranteed certainty. This tells us that Roman training was so effective that soldiers do not bend under pressure. Nothing can affect them. They're just purely soldiers. To sum up, Josephus says, I do not think it would be wrong to say that their training exercises are like bloodless battles, and their battles like bloody training exercises. Therefore, the Roman military, even in its training exercises, was almost constantly in a war setting. Harvey number 254 is a speech given by the Emperor Hadrian to Legion III Augusta in Numidia. They liked this speech so much that they put up a dedicatory monument on which they copied the text of the speech. In this speech, Hadrian praises the training exercises he watched the soldiers do. He says, "My friend, the legionary commander Catulinus, has pleaded in your defense and described all the things that might have hindered you from giving a perfect performance. All these excuses would have been acceptable if your military exercises had not been as good as they should have been. But the truth is that your performance was so good that there is no need to make any excuse at all." This suggests that Roman military training was so effective that outside distractions don't affect the Romans in their performance. Hadrian also says that he was watching very closely, and if something was not done correctly, I would have noticed. I would have pointed out any glaring mistakes on the part of the exercise. This tells us how effective Roman training was. Even in exercises, there was perfection. Harvey's selection number 255 is again by Josephus, which is about discipline rather than training. While the training described by Hadrian was very important, Josephus shows that discipline, fear, and respect were also very important. Roman soldiers needed to be able to follow orders in dangerous situations. This means that the Romans believed that their soldiers should fear their officers more than the enemy. Josephus says there are rules in the Roman army that inflict the death penalty not only for desertion, but also for seemingly trivial neglect of duty. These rules are intended to make soldiers more afraid of officers than the rules and also their enemy, so that when faced with an enemy, they still listen to the orders of their officer. Josephus also says the soldiers' great obedience to their officers makes them a useful presence in peacetime, and in war causes the whole army to act as if it were one body. Harvey's selection number 256 is the historian Tacitus, describing the events after the death of Augustus in the military, even though he's writing over a century later. He tells us that the soldiers mutinied because of the uncertainty of the time and the conditions of service, which had become worse over time. Many of the soldiers present were also at the end of their service, 25 years, but hadn't been discharged formally and had become worse. And so they hadn't been discharged formally. Tacitus cites, quotes, / makes up a speech by one of the mutineering soldiers. This soldier says, "We have wandered enough like sheep these long years. In some cases, that service has gone on for 30 or even 40 years and left us old men. Most of us bear serious scars from our war wounds. Military service is difficult and unprofitable. We sell our bodies and souls for a mere 10 bronze coins a day, and out of this we have to pay for our clothing, equipment, and tents. Think of the hardships, beatings and wounds, harsh winters, unbearable summers, not to mention the harsh realities of war itself and even peace, a time that brings no end to our suffering." This passage reflects how the superior discipline of the Roman army could become a serious burden in the eyes of the soldier, especially in times of uncertainty or even in times of peace. Harvey's selection number 258 speaks about Roman cruelty in war from yet again Josephus. Despite training and discipline, the Romans could be very cruel. Defeated enemies had to be prepared for heavy losses in retreat that was likely to come after the loss, because, as mentioned before, the cavalry would follow them and kill anyone they caught fleeing. In addition, resistance to conquest or rebellion was also treated harshly. Captured cities were often sacked and pillaged, and bloodshed usually was not limited to soldiers, but spread to the entire civilian population. In this passage, Josephus describes the siege of Jerusalem by Vespasian, who was under Nero's command at the time, when Judea rebelled from Rome in 66 CE. Josephus says, "The Romans had climbed the last wall without meeting resistance and without bloodshed, and even now they were shocked that no one came out to oppose them. They drew their swords and ran down the streets, killing everyone that they came upon. Some people fled into their homes and locked the doors, so the Romans burned the houses with people still inside. In addition to any hostile survivors, they also killed the old and the weak. This tells us that once inside a besieged city, Roman soldiers would begin the wholesale killing of the inhabitants. Titus, the son of Vespasian and commanding general, allowed this because the sacking of the cities was one of the rewards for a victorious Roman army. In addition, Vespasian, in charge, also saw this as justified owing to the resist that the insurgents had mounted against the Romans. Despite the change in dynamics between frontier and army forces, Republican and Empire, the army was still an important part of society, especially in border regions where the majority of the troops were concentrated, thanks to Augustus's setting up of permanent garrisons on the frontiers. However, their role has changed significantly from an active military force to protection. As I mentioned before, 3/4 of the imperial budget in the empire was spent on the army. This is because mobilizing, equipping, and feeding the several 100,000 men stationed between Britain and the Arabian deserts could not be sustained by the market alone. It required the direct intervention of the central and local authorities. The presence at the borders of our military at the borders drove crucial developments in the economy and society. And because of this, through the army, many members of local aristocracies were integrated into the Roman Empire. Harvey Selection 252 tells us exactly where a bunch of different legions were garrisoned during the rule of Tiberius. Since Augustus kept a standing army when they were not at war, they served as garrisons along the frontiers. Here, Tacitus documents where legions were placed during the reign of Tiberius. In Italy, they were in Misenum, Ravenna, and of course, Rome. Elsewhere in the provinces, they were in Gaul, Spain, Mauritania in Africa, Syria, Thrace, and along the Danube River. As you can see, the military was very widespread, and this allowed the Romans to keep control of their very disparate military forces and provinces. To summarize, here's a TED Ed video that describes a day in the life of a Roman soldier.
The year is 15 CE, and the Roman Empire is prospering. Most of the credit will go to the emperor, but this success wouldn't have been possible without loyal soldiers like Servius Felix. Servius enlisted as a legionary 8 years ago at age 18, the son of a poor farmer with few prospects. Unlike the majority of legionaries, he doesn't gamble, so he's been able to save most of his wages. He's even kept his viaticum, the 3 gold coins he received when he enlisted. If he survives until retirement, he'll receive several acres of land, and he's grown rather fond of a girl back home whom he intends to marry. But he'll have to wait until he completes his 25 years of service before that can happen, and the life of a legionary is dangerous and grueling. Today, Servius's legion, along with 3 others, has undertaken a great march of 30,000 Roman paces, the equivalent of nearly 36 kilometers. Servius's armor and weapons, including his gladius, scutum, and 2 pila, weigh over 20 kilograms. And that's not counting his backpack, or sarcina, which contains food and all the tools he needs to help build the camp: spade, saw, pickaxe, and basket. Although Servius is exhausted, he won't sleep much tonight. He's been assigned the first watch, which means looking after the baggage animals and keeping alert against a possible ambush. After he's done, he lies awake, dreading the day ahead, which will force him to recall his worst nightmare. At dawn, Servius eats breakfast with his 7 tent companions. They're like a family, all bearing scars from the battles they've fought together. Servius is from Italia, but his fellow soldiers hail from all over the empire, which stretches from Syria to Spain. So they're all far from home in the northern land of Germania. Servius's legion and 3 others with him today are under the command of Emperor Tiberius's nephew, Germanicus, named for his father's military successes against the Germanic tribes. Each legion has close to 5,000 men, divided into cohorts of about 500, further subdivided into centuries of around 80 to 100 men. Each century is commanded by a centurion. An aquilifer, or eagle-bearer, marches at the head of each legion, carrying its eagle standard. The centurions march beside the legionaries, belting out orders: dex, sin, right, left, starting with the right foot as the left is considered unlucky or sinister. Despite the strict discipline, there's tension in the air. Last year, some legions in the area revolted, demanding better pay and a cut in the length of service. Only their general's charisma and negotiating skills prevented wholesale mutiny. Today is a just march, only 30 kilometers. As the marshes and forests of Germania lie beyond the empire's road system, the men must build causeways and bridges to make headway, something they've recently spent more time doing than fighting. Finally, they arrive at their destination, a place Servius knows too well. It's a clearing on the outskirts of the Teutoburg forest, where 6 years ago, during the reign of the Emperor Augustus, Germanic tribes under their chieftain Arminius ambushed and destroyed 3 legions. Proceeding along a narrow path, the legions were attacked from forest cover under torrential rain, with their escape blocked. It was one of the worst defeats the Romans ever suffered, and Augustus never lived it down. Servius was one of the few survivors. Servius still has nightmares of his comrades lying where they fell. But now the army is back to bury the dead with full military honors. As he helps in the task, he can't help wondering whether the bones he handles belonged to someone he knew. Several times he wants to weep aloud, but he pushes on with the task. The glory of the empire can go to the crows. All he craves is to retire on a small farm with his wife-to-be, if the gods should spare his life for 17 more years.